Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out this afternoon. Those of you who's been to other events in the Upper West Side today? Other events, I can see the stickers. Well done. It's a whole Israel celebration today. So thank you for joining us. My name is Orly Moss. I'm the Jewish agency Shlichat BJ, and I'll hand the microphone over to Rabbi Marcelo Bronstein, who will introduce our speakers tonight.
So we have the tremendous honor and pleasure to have Ruth Gavison with us. I believe she is one of the sharpest minds in Israel today, and I had the privilege of meeting her in her office. She was kind enough to welcome me 2 years ago, and since then we have the privilege of having her at BJ. This is the second time. Professor Ruth Gavison is the Chaim H. Cohen Professor Emerita of Human Rights at Hebrew University of Yerushalayim. She has published extensively in Israel and abroad, and her many awards included the very prestigious Israel Prize for Legal Research in 2011. She authors with Rabbi Yaakov Meidan the Gavison-Meidan Covenant on State and Religious Issues Among Jews. She was a member of the Winograd Commission, which investigated the 2006 Lebanon War, and more recently she was commissioned by the Ministry of Justice to report on the constitutional anchoring of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, and submitted her recommendations in November 2014. Professor Gavison is a founding member and past chairperson and president of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, and the founding president of Metzilah, a center for Zionist, Jewish, liberal, and humanistic thought. And Professor Gavison is going to be interviewed by your beloved Dr. Jonathan Cummins, as an adjunct professor of political science at Baruch College, City University of New York, and director of intracommunal affairs in the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York. A political analyst, he previously established and headed the Israeli Office of BICOM, the Britain-Israel Communication and Research Center. He was worked as a parliamentary assistant at the Knesset, as an analyst in an Israeli venture capital fund, as an intelligence officer in the IDF. He is only slightly accidentally the husband of Orly Moss. So she's making him work. BJ, Director of Israel's Engagement and Shlicha, and this is going to be an awesome conversation between the two of you. Bruchim Habayim. Thank you for being here, Professor Gavison.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Again, wonderful to see so many people here celebrating Yom Ha'atzmaut. And we are talking today about visions for Israel. And there's really no better person to have this conversation with, I think, than Professor Ruth Gavison. As Marcelo has said, one of Israel's sharpest minds, sharpest legal minds, and a commentator and a director of Israel's public conversations on the space where law meets politics. But particularly what I think we should be focusing our conversation on this afternoon, as Marcelo already suggested, is the conversation about Israel's future, which talks about this question, a sometimes vexed question, of Israel's real nature or its vision, what Israel believes itself to be. And that conversation often boils down to a question about the nature of Israel as a Jewish state and the nature of Israel as a democracy. And sometimes that's posited as a polarity, either this or that. But you've done some work recently, the report that Marcelo mentioned, the report commissioned by the then Minister of Justice, Tzipi Livni, who asked you to comment on, think about the question in its broadest sense, but then to think about how to find some practical answers. As a politician, she was interested in addressing the question of what we'd call the constitutional anchoring. In simple words, trying to find some laws or statements that might give that vision of Israel some clarity. So there are many things for us to talk about here, but let's start with that first question about polarity, about two values which seem to be in opposition to each other. On the one hand, Israel is a Jewish state, and on the other hand, Israel is a democracy. What can you tell us about that? What did you find out in your research and writing this report?
Well, the truth of the matter is that I was commissioned by the Minister of Justice because the context of my work was legislative proposals. So it wasn't just coming out of the blue, should we now enact a law saying that Israel is this and that, Jewish and democratic, or just Jewish or just democratic, or something else. But the fact of the matter was that she was responding to the fact that there were some bills on the table of the Knesset to declare in a basic law, that is the constitutional arrangement in Israel, a constitutional enactment to define Israel in a constitutional way as the nation state of Jews. And this law, the proposals included all kinds of things like the anthem and the signs and the calendar and the day of rest, all kinds of things, language, things that are part of the reality in Israel for a long time. But they wanted to put it into a basic law. And they wanted to say democracy and they wanted to say human rights, but the major thing they wanted to stress was to put on a constitutional basis the character of Israel as the nation state of Jews, not as a Jewish state, as the nation state of Jews. And they explain that this law was needed because there was an erosion of the commitment of Israeli Jews, and especially the courts, in their commitment to the idea that Israel was indeed the nation state of Jews, the idea that was in the initial declaration of independence of the state of Israel. And what they wanted to say is there is an imbalance now in Israel, a constitutional imbalance. And we want by law to rebalance the vision of Israel and to make it clear that it still includes the element of Israel as a nation state of Jews. Now, people who objected to the legislation were saying, no, you don't understand what's going on. This declaration is terrible because it says that Israel is a nation state of Jews, and it implies that the fact that it's a nation state of Jews is more important than the fact that it is a democracy. And you shouldn't do that. And when I was first commissioned to do the work, I tried to write a text of a preamble to a constitution that will describe Israel as both Jewish, the nation state of the Jewish people, and as a committed democracy, and with a commitment to human rights. In a way that will make clear that the idea is not to make the Jewish nation of Israel more salient than its democracy, but to make it very clear that the vision of Israel is complex. It's not just a neutral democracy. It's not just a state committed to human rights. It is also the one and only state in the world in which there is a Jewish majority, and Jews exercise their right to national self-determination. After I looked a lot into the issue, I reached the conclusion, and this is the crux of my recommendations. They are now in a book form with a lot of history and background. I reached the conclusion that it is indeed very important to reaffirm the fact that the vision of Israel is a complex vision. It has three main components. The first component, the raison d'etre of this country, is the fact that the Jewish people, who always lived as a minority within diaspora communities, wanted to have one place in the world, in their ancient homeland, in which it would be an independent majority community. So the Zionists, this idea of Israel as a nation state of Jews, is indeed a critical part of the vision of Israel. But in the declaration and in Israel itself, this commitment is joined by two other commitments, not just one, two other commitments. One is to democracy, and the other is to human rights. Both these commitments are also in the declaration. And what we need to do now is, because of recent arguments that Jewish is inconsistent with democracy, so Israel has to choose either Jewish or democratic, and that if Israel is Jewish, it must necessarily not have the ability to give full equality to the Arab minority within Israel. If you want to show that the vision is integrated and should maintain all three components, you do need to reaffirm that. But the question now is, how do you do that in the best way? And my conclusion was that legalizing this, entrenching this in a binding law, making the vision of Israel a matter of legal determination, is just going to make the vision of Israel more divisive, instead of reaffirming the vision of Israel as something that is the shared vision of all Jews, and I believe also of all Israelis. So I think we have decided that we are going to make my answers to Jonathan relatively short, because what we really want to do is to open up a real conversation here. So I can talk about this subject for many hours, but we're going to try and make this short so that we can have a real conversation.
Absolutely. So let me ask one more question, then we'll open up for questions. So you talk about, rather than a polarity, a choice between one or the other, a triangular relationship. That's to say, Israel is a Jewish state, Israel is a democracy, and Israel is a state committed to human rights. And that those three are a constantly shifting and very complex pattern of sometimes competing identities, but nonetheless, those are the heart of the vision of Israel. You said something else which I think is worth talking about in a little more detail. You flagged the possible dangers of leaving the determination of these questions in the hands of lawyers and courts. And in your document here, you subtitle or sub-paragraph one of your arguments in praise of vagueness. Why should we be vague about these questions? What's the virtue in vagueness?
Okay, many people in Israel think that the declaration is a very good statement of the vision of Israel. And indeed it is. It's a very moving text. I haven't brought it because I didn't want to take too much of it. It's really a beautiful text, and I think it's a pity. We should have had it in here. But in any event, the declaration is a long document. It's a festive, celebratory document. It's also a performative document. It is the declaration of the establishment of the state. So it's a performative legal document. But it's also something that gives a lot of background to the history of the creation of the state. Now, the declaration was never intended to be a legally binding text. And its longest part is an answer to external challenges about why Jews do have a right to have a state in their ancient homeland. It's not a trivial question. And the first part of the declaration answered that the declaration commits the state to the protection of democracy and human rights in very, very moving texts. But what is very important is that it says we're going to protect human rights in the tradition of the prophets of Israel. Now, the declaration is a work of art because Jews in Israel in the pre-state period, like Jews today and everywhere, disagreed about unbelievable amount of issues. For instance, what is Judaism? Is Judaism a religion? Is Judaism a nation? Is Judaism a combination of that? If Judaism is religion, is it only Orthodox religion? Or do we have the flexibility to maybe think that Jewish religion should be adjusted to other things? As you well know, these issues are in constant disagreement among Jews to this very day, and they were controversial in pre-state Israel. There is also other question about the state. What kind of state will this be? We said it was a Jewish state. This is the United Nations Partition Resolution of November 29th, 1947. But what do we mean by a Jewish state? Some people think that a Jewish state is a Jewish theocracy. Some people became Zionists because they were anti-religious. They thought that the Jewishness of the state should be cultural and anti-clerical, at least, if not anti-religious. Many people had, unclear attitudes to this question. Should it be capitalist or should it be communist? Should Israel be oriented to the West or should it be oriented to the Soviet Union? I mean, these questions were very, very, very difficult questions. In order for the Jews of pre-state Israel to agree on a declaration and a vision for the state, these major disagreements had to be bracketed. And the declaration is an unbelievable achievement of bracketing the disagreement, but maintaining in very evocative terms the commitment to these three ideals: Jewish self-determination, democracy, and human rights. Now, it's very important that this is so. This is not merely political. This is cultural, ideological, and moral. Because we don't want to create the idea that we have human rights, that this is something that is external to Judaism, it is imposed on us by the international community and international law, and we don't want to protect human rights, but we are forced to do that by the nations. No. Human rights is part of our tradition. The reason we want to have a Jewish state is because we want to, in our state, show how a Jewish state can be sensitive to human rights. We want to invoke those powerful, evocative statements within the Jewish tradition about charity and justice and peace. These are not alien elements. These are our Jewish elements. And in our state, we will make them a part. And the depth of the Jewish tradition will support both human rights and democracy. It's not three independent ideals, each coming from a different source. This is the integrated vision of what we want to do because we want a Jewish state. So it was very important then, and it's still extremely important now. Now it's even more important in an urgent sense. Some people are saying, no, it's becoming too difficult to square liberalism with Zionism, and some of the establishment thought that we are going to check in our liberalism, but they're shocked to see that we are checking in our Zionism instead. This is a very dangerous claim, if it's true. I want to say in a straight face that Zionism and liberalism are totally consistent. There is no reason to choose between Jewish and democratic, between Jewish and human rights. There are tensions between them, but there are tensions within democracy and tensions within human rights and tensions within Judaism. And what we need to do as societies, as communities, and as a state is to negotiate these differences in a credible and enduring way so that we can have all kinds of forms of modern Jewish lives. We can have the classical form of Jews living as minorities within host societies, but we can also have a majority community of Jews seeking to negotiate all matters, not only their own private community, religious, cultural matters, all matters of their states inspired by the values of the Jewish tradition.
Thank you.
Okay.
But for that, we need to be vague. We need to not
Yes.
pin ourselves down to a particular form of words to be contested in law courts by lawyers. That, I think, is what comes up extremely clearly from this work, from this report.
I'll give you an example that I think will make this very clear. The declaration is very evocative and very beautiful. And the last sentence of the declaration is a performative statement. Here we are signing the declaration. All representatives of Jewish streams, all of them, from the atheist Mapam to the ultra-Orthodox, all Jews signed that declaration. So now what do they say? What do they invoke when they signed this declaration? There was a debate, of course. So some people said, how can we, Jews, have a state without mentioning God, the promised land? How can we? The Mapam came and said, we're not going to have God in this. God has nothing to do with this. This is us, the Jews, not God. So what do we do? So, when there is the will, there is the way. What they do is they say, putting our trust in Tzur Yisrael. Tzur Yisrael. Tzur Yisrael is an expression from the sources. It is used as the name of God, usually with the addition Tzur Yisrael vego'alo. And indeed, some of the translations of the declaration say the Almighty, or even the Almighty God. But the official translation says the Rock of Israel. The Rock of Israel doesn't sound so great. But the Rock of Israel is the way for the signatories of the declaration to say something about Jewishness that is not necessarily religious. And this is what we need to do for all of these, for Jewishness, for democracy, and for human rights. Because if we don't let these things be inclusive, they cannot allow us to form the function that a vision must have. Because a vision of a state or a community must be something that permits all of them to strengthen their commitment to the vision and work in their different ways towards the same vision. This amount of solidarity and cohesion is critical. And in order to achieve it, you must distinguish between the parts of the vision that are shared by all, and they have to be limited and ambiguous so that people can give them different interpretations, and the parts of the vision that need to be concretized and implemented by giving them richer interpretations on which you may and you will disagree. And in a democracy, you will disagree on them in a political way, in a social way, in a cultural way, and not by going to the streets and murdering your adversaries. Okay.
Thank you. Let's open up some questions. Who has some? Oh, lots. Good. Let me start over here, please, at the back.
Israel is 20% Arab, yet they're not represented in Knesset. What will happen with the Jews?
Wait
a second. What happens if Israel becomes 51% Arab? How will it remain a Jewish state?
Well, this is clearly a serious concern. And part of the intensity of the debate about the future of the territories is centered around the question of how critical is a stable and a large Jewish majority to the ability of Israel to be both Jewish and democratic. And I'm among the people who think that indeed it is critical. So my wish not to see Israel annex the West Bank is based in part on the necessity for Israel to maintain its Jewish majority. But some people say, well, this is not that important because even if we don't do that, we may have a non-Jewish majority because of the movement in of Palestinians and the large Arab minority and the foreign workers. So maybe we are going to lose the Jewish majority anyway. And indeed, this is one of the toughest disagreements in Israel. What should be Israel's immigration policy? Now, this is not a subject that is unique to Israel. Unfortunately, every day you open the newspapers and people are dying, running away for their life and for their dignity. Every day, this is terrible. And Israel has a very long land border with countries in which life is desperate. And now it actually has land borders with many countries in which life is desperate. And the question is, what should Israel do? And this is a major debate within Israeli society. And in fact, one of the elements of the debate is indeed the question of how seriously should Israel take the fact that it needs to maintain a Jewish majority. And some people are saying, we who are running away for our lives that were not admitted, we need to be very generous to refugees. And this is about refugees who came in from the Egyptian border, tens of thousands of them. And the government is saying, no, we can't do that. A, we close the border, and B, we must reduce the number. We may get a few, but we cannot afford to have so many, not because we don't understand their predicament, we do, but because this is a growing community. I mean, a large percentage of children born in Tel Aviv today are black. It's not about racism, it's about the constituency of Israeli society. So this is a community, this is not individuals whom you're getting in as on an individual basis. This is a cultural, distinct cultural community that is growing within Israel. And the government is saying, we would like to find ways to not make this a problem of another group within Israel. And the human rights organizations are taking the government to the court every time, and now there is another pending petition on this very issue. And the people who supported this legislation I was talking about are saying, among other things, that the reason that the Supreme Court of Israel is not sufficiently sensitive to the need to maintain a Jewish democracy is part of the erosion in the commitment of the leadership of the country to the question of the conditions that are required in order to maintain Israel as a Jewish democracy. And this is a debate, and it's going to be decided, and the court has twice now invalidated laws that sought to limit this immigration, and the government and the Knesset are enacting these laws, and we will see how this conversation is going to develop. But this is a conversation that is taking place now within Israel.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. You said that the state is based on the Jewishness, Zionism, and human rights and democracy. And this should be a shared vision for the Jews of the world and of the citizens of Israel, right?
I think it is substantially shared by Jews.
Right.
Yes.
And the citizens of Israel. But how do you really expect Palestinian or Arab Israelis to share in the vision? Well, human rights, sure. Democracy, definitely. But the Jewish part, it's hard for them, I think.
It's very hard for them.
Because
it's very hard for them.
It's a difficult thing, living in a world, even if they're 20%, but everything, you've been there. Everything is overwhelmingly Jewish.
This is a very interesting question.
They don't really sing the national anthem. They can't.
It's true. It's true. I think it's something that we need to concede. But that doesn't mean that Israel cannot remain a Jewish state and maintain this element as part of its vision. Because there are all kinds of states in the world. Some states are like this one. They are neutral arbiters. They're what we called civic states. All the non-civic affiliations of American citizens, at least formally, are privatized. So as far as the state is concerned, you are only Americans and you are only individual. Whatever you want to do as a group, you may do within freedom of association, freedom of religion, freedom of culture, freedom of this and freedom of the other. But in terms of the state, you are Americans, period. Well, this is of course not totally true. As you well know, the language is English and there are all kinds of things that make this country, this is socially speaking a Christian country. It's not, it cannot be a neutral country, but this is fine. This is a good way to be. But not all states are like that. And part of the problem in the debate in Israel is about the legitimacy of other forms of states. That is, nation states. It's sometimes extremely hard for Americans to understand that it's legitimate to have nation states. And in order to make it easier for you, I will just remind you all that just a few months ago, the Scots were going to ask whether they wanted to break the 100-year-old agreement with England. And why did they want, some of them, almost a majority, not just, why did they want to do that? Because they wanted to have their own nation state. They wanted to be a majority community within their homeland. And they have a lot of devolution, they have a lot of autonomy, they are not assimilated into England, but they still, many of them, not a majority, but many of them wanted to have one place in the world, in their homeland, in which they will have not a United Kingdom, but a Scottish nation state. Same with Czechoslovakia. Nationalism is a need of people. Not everyone needs that, but some people do. And when they do, it's legitimate that they can enjoy autonomy or self-determination. And under some circumstances, it's not only legitimate that they enjoy self-determination like the Scots now enjoy within England or the Catalans within Spain. It's also legitimate that they will secede or make a new state. And this is a long debate within the liberal scholarship. I don't want to go into that unless you want me to. I will if you want me to, if you insist. But I want to say that this is a very good question. But the Arabs, the Arab minority in Israel, can be asked not to become Zionist, not to affirm the fact that the state is built on the territory in which they used to be a majority. They cannot like that. They're not expected to. But they are now Israeli citizens. And the question for them is not to become Zionists, but to concede the fact that they enjoy within Israel levels of self-determination, political freedom, civil and political rights, social and economic and cultural rights, and a general level of welfare that is relatively much higher than any enjoyed by any other Arab group in the region, even before the catastrophe that the region is going through now, in which groups are persecuted, killed, assimilated, coerced, just because of their Muslim, Christian identity. So I don't think that it is at all a problem to ask the minority of Arabs in Israel to endorse the fact that not only are they equal citizens in Israel, and they should fight to make it more and better and more hospitable to them and anything. I'm all for it. But I don't think it's at all problematic to ask him to affirm that the reason that they are enjoying all of this in Israel is not only because this is Israel and it is a democracy, but also because this is the Jewish state. Because their lot in the Jewish state is much better than their lot would have been in any Arab state, including their very dear, not yet existent Palestinian state. And they, when they are candid and fair, they concede that.
Thank you. Yes, question here, please. Yeah, that was you.
Apart from its evocative beauty and its delicate balance. In terms of the Declaration of Independence, what do you envision its role or its importance? What can it be in the coming years?
Well, I think that visions can come in many, many different ways. And I would like to see a larger place for the text in Israel life. I think that for any society, a vision is something that is very important, because since societies and states do require a measure of solidarity, they do require a measure of shared cohesion that make you willing to work for the flourishing of this particular society. You know, Americans are working on being patriots, American patriots, and rightly so. It's very important for a healthy society to have a sense of solidarity with one's co-patriots, fellow citizens. Now, Israel, because of what we heard now, must have 3 circles of solidarities going on all at once. One is the civic circle, the solidarity of all the citizens of Israel. They are the demos of Israel. They make the decisions, they vote, they can legislate. And there are majorities and minorities and disagreements, blah, 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 but this is the demos. It's very important that there will be civic solidarity, and to some extent, despite complaints, there is. Okay. Then there should be a Jewish, Zionist, Israeli solidarity that will support the need of the Zionist community of Israel to put in unbelievable efforts in order to keep the state safe and flourishing. And this is, as we heard and as we should concede, it's not something that the civic body can fully endorse because of the unresolved conflict between Israel and the Palestinians and the Arab world. And then there is the 3rd circle of solidarity, and this is the World Jewry circle of solidarity, which I think is very critical both for the flourishing of the Jewish people and for the flourishing of Israel itself. Israel is stronger if it has the support of World Jewry, and World Jewry is stronger if there is the experiment of Israel as one form of Jewish life. I was extremely saddened to read that a large percentage of American Jewry wouldn't think that the disappearance of Israel would be to them a personal tragedy. This is not a good sign. It shows a dangerous break in the understanding of Jews outside of Israel, that even if they are embarrassed by Israel, even if it's hard to identify with Israel, if they think that the loss of Israel as a form of Jewish life is irrelevant, indifferent to their welfare, I think we are in serious trouble. We need to think how to change this number.
Yes, please.
So you described a very complex conversation about the vision of Israel. Do you feel that it has to be resolved before Israel can actually reach peace with its neighbors? And so there's an extra layer of complexity here, because perhaps until Israel understands what Israel's going to be, it can't address itself to the outside world and more particularly its neighbors.
The answer is no. The debate, the internal debate in Israel about its vision, about what Judaism is, who is a Jew, role of state, monopoly of a marriage and divorce, is going to be ongoing, enduring, and permanent. The need to... You think we're going to stop arguing about that? Come on. We're not. You know that. Egypt and Jordan made peace with Israel when Israel has not resolved these issues, unresolvable issues, and before they resolved their opposition to having a Jewish state in the Middle East. They are not crazy about this, but they thought that, politically speaking, it made more sense for them to have peace with Israel than to continue the struggle with Israel. The negotiations with the Palestinians are pretty autonomous to this internal Jewish debate in Israel and within world Jewry about what Israel stands for. Unfortunately, I mean, this is non-political and non-partisan, but my feeling has always been that it's only with the Palestinians. I don't know about Egypt, but the Palestinians, Egypt too. With the Palestinians, only a right-wing government, can make peace with the Palestinians. I don't know if it's going to happen in my lifetime, but only a right-wing government can make peace with the Palestinians, because if a right-wing government makes peace with the Palestinians, the left will support it. If the left wants to make peace with the Palestinians, and it's not clearly the case that there are guarantees of the security to Israel, the right is not going to go along, and it may be right in not wanting to go along. So no, it's not going to be resolved, and this is good, because these two processes should be autonomous. We should seek peace with our neighbors actively, all the time. And we should not resolve our internal differences. We should not seek to resolve them. They're not resolvable. We should seek to negotiate them in a way that maintain the balances between the three circles of solidarity in the best possible way. So we don't have to twist something in a declaration in the eyes of the Arab minority. We don't have to declare that Hebrew has a stronger standing in Israel than Arabic. It does. De facto it does, and it will, because the minority always has to learn the majority language more than the majority has to learn the minority language. So here, the social processes do the work. You do not have to twist, you do not have to annoy, you do not have to infuriate by declarations. On some other things, maybe these powers are not so clear. Maybe you need some affirmation, but even that can be done in a respectful, in a considerate way. You don't have to try to humiliate them, to make it clear that they're a minority, to make it clear that they're not full members. This is something that is part of the reality of Israeli society. Why not encourage them to feel like real and full stakeholders in the country, as many of them do and should do? That would be much better for Israel and for the relationship in the region.
Thank you. So there, again, I think is my point, or your point, about the virtue of vagueness, of not seeking a final declaration, words on a paper that can be litigated and taken to court. There is a value in an ongoing negotiation, an ongoing relationship of these values which are connected, but are also in constant dialogue with each other, as are the people.
I totally. I mean, this is a very good way of presenting it. But I want to give you another example that is not connected to the Palestinians or the Arabs, but I think is very critical to the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. And this is the question of, does the Jewish state have to be secular? In a sense, America is a secular state. It's a secular state, but it encourages religious identities. It respects religious identities, but it declares, at least on the federal level, a separation between state and religion. Now, many Americans, including Zionist Orthodox Americans, want Israel to also have separation of state and religion, not necessarily state and Jewish identity. There is a non-religious component to Jewish identity. So you can be a Jewish state as against Arab state, but you shouldn't be a Jewish state as against Muslim or Christian state. Well, Israel is not a Jewish state as against Muslim or Christian. It doesn't have established religion as England does. And in principle, at least, it looks at religions equally. But it has many things that are established, like in Orthodox, a religious monopoly, not only for Jews, on marriage and divorce, or all kinds of other things. But this is not the point. I think the important point for us is that for many Israelis, the more important part of their Jewish identity that is relevant to Israel is not the religious one, it's the national cultural one. Whereas for American Jews, because of the nature of the American Constitution and its type of democracy, to say that Jews are a people might create problems of, double loyalties. And it's convenient for people to say that for them, Judaism is a religion, despite the fact that many Jews in this country are non-observant and don't see Judaism as a religion. See the Pew report. So what's happening here? What is happening is a fascinating ambiguity. Most people who want to be engaged Jews understand that in this country, the stable way of being an engaged Jew is by joining a religious community. So you need to have a broad range of religious communities. You have to have religious communities that are hospitable to liberal and non-orthodox visions of Judaism. And you do something that in Israel actually you don't have come naturally. You do it via working with Jewish sources, because this is, after all, a religion. I mean, even Reform is, to some extent, based on religious texts. So here what you have is a way of maintaining a Jewish identity that is not hostile to Jewish sources and to the Jewish tradition and to Jewish religion, even if in your private life you're not religious. In Israel, it's totally different. In Israel, you have the option of being a very active Jew and being totally secular and even anti-religious. It's a problem. I don't think it's easy for them. I don't think it's easy to transmit a Jewish identity without some tradition. But this is an Israeli problem. It's not a problem here. But because we have this in Israel, because we have this option of secular Jewish identity, there is no incentive on part of the secular Jews to be connected to Jewish tradition. So you have a better go at it. Because some Jews in Israel are very Jewish, but they don't know the classical, basic Jewish texts and Jewish practices that are the kind of Jewish tradition that kept Jews together for generations without a state. So Israel gives you an opportunity to have a Jewish identity that's based on territory, state, politics, practices, the need to solve problems together as Jews. Very powerful. But this doesn't necessarily have a connection to Jewish sources in a way that you have. Now, all this is built on the ambiguity within Israel and here. But what is Judaism? Who is a Jew? What does it mean for a person to make a commitment to Judaism, not to Zionism, not to Israel, to Judaism? How do you maintain Jewish identity in a liberal society that assimilates you? How do you do that? What is the answer to that? Do you value your Jewish identity, and why? These are questions that many Jews in Israel don't have to ask themselves. And you do have to ask yourselves, and it gives you some Jewish resilience that some secular Jews realize they don't have only when they go on sabbatical and they lose all their crutches of the public culture that they take for granted when they live in the one and only Jewish state. Okay, so we need to keep these conversations going, and we need to understand that solutions that are going to be required here are not necessarily applicable there, and that elements of Jewish identity there are potentially interesting but not necessarily fully relevant or implementable here. And we need to see this not as a difference, but as part of the Jewish genius of continuity, part of the richness of ways of being Jewish, that is, I think, the only hope of maintaining a rich, varied Jewish life in both the Zionist way and the non-Zionist way, in both the Israeli way and the non-Israeli way for generations to come.
Thank you. Let's have another. Let's take 2 or 3 questions now together and take it that way. Yes, let's have one here, please.
Hi, yes. I was wondering if you're in favor of Israel continuing not to have a constitution, where the constitution would make more specific what now is maybe more ambiguous, and that has certain advantages.
Okay, question about the constitution. Yes, over here, please.
You've made a very excellent case in favor of vagueness, but I'm curious to know who is supporting the legislation and what are the reasons for that support?
Okay, connection there. And there was a question at the back there. Yes, please.
Yes, I had a question. I just got back from Israel. I've been there for 3 months, and Rabbi, who's made Aliyah 30 years ago, I did it with him, and he said that he sees the biggest problem to democracy is not this, but that there are 16 families that control like 80% of the wealth in Israel and property, and that everyone else is just being taxed to death. I mean, gasoline is like $8 a gallon, everything is so much tax. And he says that's the biggest obstacle that he sees to democracy. So I just want to know your comments on that.
So there you go, a varied bundle of questions.
Yes, this time it's a group of questions, but they're all very different, so I'll try to... Okay, so should there be a constitution in Israel? Well, Israel is a very unique country. Israel is one of the only places in which not only do you argue whether our constitutional arrangement is good, there is also a very heated argument on whether we already have a constitution. And some people, notably the Supreme Court President Aaron Barak, says that we do because in 1992 two basic laws were passed, and they said, I don't want to go into that, it's too complicated. There is a lot of written material about this. Okay, so now should Israel have a constitution? Israel now has a few basic laws, and after 1992 it also has some judicial review. That is a power by the court to overrule and invalidate legislation by the Knesset, not only by ministries or things like that as it always had, but also by the primary legislature, the Knesset. So now Israel does have that, but it doesn't have a full unitary formal constitution. The question is, should it have one? After 1992, with the two basic law and the declaration that it was a constitutional revolution and now we have a constitution, there were in fact a few efforts to enact a constitution. And they all failed because there was no political will to do that. And the disagreements about the constitution were on 3 main issues. One is the preamble. That is, should we and how write the vision of the State of Israel into law? And as you understand, this was a huge question. But you don't necessarily have to have a very powerful preamble in a constitution. You can have what you call a thin constitution, a constitution that will only deal with the structure of government and the authorities of government, and will not deal with either Bill of Rights, which is quite emotive, and with preambles. The American Constitution doesn't have a very powerful preamble. It's not like the American Declaration of Independence, which does. So it doesn't have a preamble, and it was never used as a binding legal material. Plus, the Federalists and Philadelphia, the miracle in Philadelphia, actually said that we shouldn't have a Bill of Rights. You shouldn't have a Bill of Rights. It was added, the first 10 amendments were added after the Union was established. Okay. So you could have a thin constitution. Unfortunately for Israel, and this would be good for Israel, because we do have this problem of a very diverse civil society, and it would be good to have a system of institutions that is shared and accepted, so that it gives legitimacy to many decisions that some part of the population distrusts. Some kind of combination of legislation, government, and courts, it would be good if that had been more agreed upon than it is now. Unfortunately, there is a debate about that. There is a debate about judicial review. There is a debate on the electoral system. And there is a debate about the relationship between Parliament, the Knesset, and the government. All these issues of regime structure are controversial. So it's quite understandable why there is no political power to go through the motions of passing a constitution with or without a preamble. But yes, you're right. The preamble is part of the reason that both now and in 1950, Israel decided not to have a constitution. Now, do I like that? If we could have had a thin regime-like constitution that would, in fact, limit judicial review from what it is now under this very unclear situation, I would think this would be very good. But unfortunately, I don't think that this is in the cards for Israel now. And we have been doing, we are muddling through, but not too badly. So that's okay. Who is supporting this legislation? I said it earlier in some ways, and it's related to the answer to this question. The main reason that these people want this basic law saying that Israel is the nation state of Jews is precisely because they say that after the 1992 constitutional revolution and the acquisition of the power to invalidate Knesset laws by the court, that this has created a move towards the rhetoric of democracy and human rights. And that in order to correct this bias, what you need now is to have a constitutional statement that will outbalance the previous. Now, I think that there is something to be said for that argument, that there was an erosion, that there is too much of a human rights neutral rhetoric. I think that the political system is very polarized on this. I think the left is saying that I'm democracy and I'm human rights, and you are not interested in democracy and human rights, and everything that happens that the right wing suggests is described as anti-democratic by the left. So it's not a good place. But when I look at this country, I see that the level of polarization and accusations is very bad here too. So we are all in good company. But my argument answering them is that even if you concede, as I do, not many people in my camp do, but as I do, that there is some imbalance created, this basic law is not the right answer. But what you need to do then is to work on redressing the balance of the authorities, of the powers of the courts versus the legislature. And this is something that you do via appointments and via ethos and via discussions. And these are things that cannot be done by this law. Now, the attempt to pass this law that started was so divisive that clearly it couldn't. First of all, it's not clear to me that the laws could be passed, or that they can be passed in the future. But even had they been passed, they would have been passed as another anti-democratic legislation by right-wing, nationalistic, theocratic Israel. Now, this is the opposite of what they want. They want to redress a balance and to limit divisiveness. What they would have created is increased divisiveness, which means that what now is more or less accepted with broad consensus, Israel as a Jewish state, a democracy committed to human rights, even this would be a part of the conversation, because what they suggest is within this vision. But their opponents are saying that this is terribly anti-democratic and stuff, and these things stick. So the rhetoric would have been very bad for the vision. My argument, if you want to stress the complex vision, you need to be very careful not to pass it through legislation. The last question is, refreshingly, something totally different. There is a problem in what we call rikuziyut, that is the concentration of too much economic power in too few hands. Your tool against this is what you call antitrust. What we do what we did is not only not fight this in time, but in fact facilitated it, but a motion of privatization in which the state sold quite a lot of its holdings in very good, not very high prices to private people. So now we have a very serious problem there. But I must say that I am not completely certain how this relates to democracy, and if you allow me to compare, when we were looking into the next presidential election and we see the tycoons and the PACs gearing up to affect the elections, and I am not at all sure that democratic elections in America today are not driven by high capital to a much larger extent than they are in Israel. We just saw in Israel elections that I think defied big money in surprising ways. So I think that I can say that the economic situation, which is an important concern for Jewish solidarity and Israeli solidarity, I think it does not affect democracy as badly as some concentrations of big money does in this country.
Okay, so I can see time's moving on, but I know that there are a few people who've got questions still. Let's try and do just a couple more questions, short questions and short answers, if we can, just to try and let everybody have a voice. Yes, here, please.
Yeah, my question is short, although I'm not sure the answer is short. My question is, unlike many people, you do not put the idea of a Jewish majority as the basic definition of the Israeli vision. It is part of it, but definitely not the fundamental question, because there are many issues about the definition of Jewish vision of the state that go beyond the question of majority. And I just wonder whether I'm understanding you correctly or not.
Majority plus.
Majority plus.
But
right?
the plus is very important. Majority is there, but it's majority plus.
I hear plus. I hear the plus.
Yes, please. And last question over there, I think.
Yes, I took your point that the Arabs in Israel live much better in socioeconomic and political and legal sense than they do in most of the surrounding countries. On the other hand, they might say the basis of right comparison is not with their neighbors, but not with their brothers in other countries, but with the Jews of Israel. And so the question is, in a country where you have a discrete national minority, is the way to go, are there constitutional solutions to the problem of ongoing socioeconomic inequality, kind of structural inequality, and should those underscore the Arab citizens' individual rights, or should the Constitution give them communal rights?
Well, do we take
Yes, let me take another one, yes.
ask you about the human rights issue. So I take the point that this is a long-standing Jewish tradition, it's not an alien tradition, and also that there's broad support within Israeli society for the issue of human rights. And yet, even in the United States, particularly among young people, so even in the United States, among young people, there are serious questions raised about whether Israel is living up to its ideals of human rights. So I'd like to get your comment about that.
Okay, well, the two questions may be related because the standard complaints against Israel are discrimination of the Arab minority, resulting in very, very serious social and economic gaps between Jews and Arabs, and in general, human rights. Again, inequality of the Arab minority, but also maybe freedom of religion, freedom from religion. I don't know exactly what you mean, but it's very difficult because this is the reality of Israel is extremely complex, and to give short answers to questions like this is very difficult. But let me try. First of all, I agree that the commitment to human rights and to equality of the Arab minority is a commitment that is part of the vision. And like all elements of the vision, a vision is an ideal. You strive to attain it, and it's never there, and you constantly have to move. And what I can say, which is, I think, reassuring, but not a full answer, is that the situation of the protection of human rights in general in Israel and the situation of the Arab minority within Israel is much better now than it was 10 years ago. And it's much better. It was much better 10 years ago than it was 20 and 30 years ago. And you can see the trajectory is on the whole very, very positive in both government policies and Supreme Court and social reactions. So I think that on the whole, the trajectory is good, and we should make more efforts to improve it all the time. Three things about the rights of the Arab minority. First of all, I think the Arab minorities has in Israel at present already most of the group rights, the communal rights that minorities are supposed to have in democracies. So it's not true that they don't have them. And they do have them, and they do enjoy them, and it's fine, and they should have them. And so if you want to be more specific, I'd be very happy to say that. There are gaps between, social economic gaps between Arabs and Jews. They're not gaps between all Arabs and all Jews. I mean, Christian Arabs, for instance, are higher on the social economic educational level than most Jews. So it's not Arabs versus Jews, it's also within Arabs, it's differing. There is a great progress, but there are remaining gaps. Part of the gaps are cultural. Some of the Arab women are not allowed and encouraged to go out to work. And some of the gaps are because of baselines, and some of the gaps are because of discrimination or, say, not full access of Arabs to services, education, etc. in Israel. This is bad. I think there is progress on all of these things. I want to just add one other thing into it, and this is not apologizing, but I think it's part of explanation. When we talk about the relationship between Jews and Arabs in Israel, we must understand that it's not merely a relationship between a majority and a minority. This is also a relationship between a majority that is a minuscule minority within a region to which this minority belongs and with which there is an unresolved violent conflict that is ongoing. So it's not merely Jews kind of not being nice and gentle and generous and respectful towards Arabs. There is not only discrimination. The Arabs like to say some of their political leaders are not very facilitative of a better relations between Jews and Arabs in Israel. They always say that this is racism, that Israeli society is racist. There is some racism in Israeli society. I don't want to, deny that. But quite a lot of the Arab-Jewish friction in Israel is based on fear and worry and a sense of conflict and not on racism. It's not about superiority, it's about this is a relationship of adversity. So the claim that Jews, who are minorities also in many places, shouldn't be treated their minority better than they were used and don't do unto others what you hate when it's done to you is all very powerful. There are immense forces within Jewish Israeli civil society who work for the empowerment and for the equality of Arabs. There are immense work of Jewish philanthropy working with the Arab sector of Israeli society. But there are also serious issues, and as I say, these issues need to be negotiated within the vision of the state. Now, on human rights, it's very difficult to answer such a question because it's not really easy to know what do you mean by saying that Israel is not up to the standard in its protection of human rights. So if you give me examples, then obviously there are issues that are controversial. Now, there were a number of Supreme Court decisions in recent weeks in which, and the human rights organizations and some powers on the left say that this is, again, shows how the Supreme Court of Israel is now being less committed to the promotion of human rights because these are laws that should have been invalidated and the court is legitimating them, and in this it's anti-democratic and not protecting human rights. But you see, this is part of the problem of a democracy. When the court says that what the majority wants is illegitimate because it violates human rights organizations are very happy. And they say, there is a court in Jerusalem, the court protects human rights, great. When the court says, no, we don't think this is a violation of human rights, then they say, no, the court is wrong, and the court is pacifist, and the court is not protecting human rights. So I understand that their interpretation of what a human right is different, and it should be, than the courts. But I think Israel has a very impressive interplay between social, political, and legal forces that, again, is not perfect. There are decisions by the Supreme Court that I too think violate human rights. There are laws that the Knesset passes that I think should be invalidated. But you don't analyze a society by elements of it, unless they are becoming so structural and systemic that they are, If there is a system of open debate in which all these laws are hotly debated and are modified and are made less violative of human rights because of the political process, and then they're taken to the court, and at times they are invalidated, and at times they are modified, and at times part is validated, I think as a system of protection of human rights, this is a credible system. It should become better. There should be more education for human rights. Everything should be more. But in terms of a structural problem, I must say that I think that the criticism is not sufficiently focused to assess. I cannot say that there is a systemic structural problem in Israel of blatant violation of human rights. I cannot say that. There are cases. I want to close a circle here. Metzila, this organization that I established that deals with all these tensions, issued a couple of years ago a paper on civil marriage. And I think that the situation in Israel under which there is a religious monopoly over all matters of marriage and divorce for Jews and non-Jews alike is a violation of human rights. I think it's a bad arrangement. It's a violation of human rights. I would like to see it changed. In my covenant with the Orthodox Rav Meidan, he agreed to have this changed. And this paper also advocates that it changed. But on purpose, the two people who are writing this paper from Etzilah are two Orthodox people, two Orthodox Jews, who support civil marriage in Israel. And this is something that to me is very important, because obviously they do not support the interpretation of Jewish law as saying that it's okay to have mixed marriages, for instance, or civil marriages. What they say, which to me is very important, is that the state of Israel, because of its commitment to freedom and human rights and inclusiveness, should offer non-religious marriages to all its citizens. Then citizens will decide whether they want to marry Jewish Orthodox, Jewish non-Orthodox, mixed, whatever. But it's their decision. In a Jewish state, it's their decision. The Jewish state does not mean that they can only choose Orthodox. No. The Jewish state means that they can choose whatever they want by the law of the state, and the cultural, religious community will make its decisions in terms of culture and community. So yes, this is an area, for instance, in which Israel does not protect human rights. But you know, it's very interesting. The inability to change this law is in part because the Orthodox religious establishment, that obviously naturally objects to that, is in an alliance with the Arab minority, who doesn't want civil marriage because it doesn't want forces that will increase the civic solidarity and will decrease naturally the religious group identities of the minority. So it's very complicated.
I think that's a wonderful place to end. It's very complicated. It's such a privilege to be part of, to hear this conversation, which on one hand is as clear and precise as you could possibly hope to imagine from a professor of law from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And on the other hand, contains within it all the ambiguities and the complexities and the nuance and the need for dialogue and negotiation, what you called muddling through, which is so authentic and so recognizable, and I think so such an important part of Israeli political culture. I think this has been
and Jewish
political culture. I think this has been an extraordinary way for us to think together, really with your help, about some of these complicated, difficult issues for which there may not be any solutions, and the fact that there are no solutions may in fact be a great blessing to us. So Professor, thank you very, very much.
I just want to echo Jonathan's words. So thank you, Professor, for being here today, for helping us really delve into these issues. I think that BJ has always positioned itself in a place where it's trying to hold the stick at both ends and kind of say, you know, there are two sides and we want to try and examine everything and live in the tension between those dichotomies. And so this has been really fantastic, and thank you, Jonathan, for stepping up again for the community. Good night.